My name is Juniper, and I'm an alcoholic. I'm also an adult child of an alcoholic. That'll piss some of you off. I'm also a sexual addict. That may entice some of you. I also have an eating disorder, compulsive overeater. I'm also a workaholic. I am also a therapist. Can you see those beady eyes forming out in the audience? You know how we love to hate therapists. I'm also a priest. And for all you recovering Catholics, oh well. And I'm also gay. So I think I've just about given something for everybody to be turned off by. I say that because we have this marvelous disease that has as its primary symptom denial, and since I know I'm going to be saying some things that will make you uncomfortable, you will probably use one of those things, or that I'm tall, or that I'm white, or God knows what else you'll come up with in order to not listen. And so I want to tell you from the very beginning that God sent me here. I know that today because I did absolutely nothing to come to the state of Michigan. When I left the state of Michigan, I promised I would never come back. That's when I was drinking. God brought me back here sober for a reason, and I want to share with you today some of my experience about what it means to get well, not just sober, but well as the experience of a lot of my patients. Now, all those things I told you about myself are really not the whole story, because the one final thing I have to say, and I always introduce myself at conventions by saying that besides being an alcoholic and an adult child and a sex addict and a therapist and a workaholic and having an eating disorder and being a priest and being gay, is that I'm also an alien from another planet. Now, some of you may not quite identify with that, but that's only your denial. Now, for those of you who don't know what it means to be an alien from another planet, when I'm in other states, that's what I tell them. I'm an alien from another planet. I feel safe to say that here that means I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But for those of you who don't feel that you're an alien from another planet, I simply want to ask a very simple question, kind of so you can identify and we'll all know that we're in the same club. How many of you saw E.T.? How many of you cried? That line about go home got you, didn't it? Yeah, that was your story, kids. I want to say that I really will try during this talk to watch my language. A lot of people have a funny thing about priests and how priests should talk. And if you have a problem with swearing, a priest swearing, I suggest you go to the seminary, get ordained, and do what you need to do. But, what you got today is me. And those of you who may think that a priest spent his time drinking in the back of a church reading a Bible, let me tell you, that ain't how it works. And that as a sex addict, I was trashier than most of you, and I was drinking to screw. And I did a whole lot of it during a whole lot of the time that I was drinking. And during all that thing, I learned how to swear, and I haven't, then I've spent the last almost 10 years working with alcoholics, and that hasn't helped clean up my language at all. If you are real uncomfortable with swearing, I suggest you work with newcomers. especially those of you who are Presbyterian and in Al-Anon. Now, I only say one nasty thing about Al-Anons during the whole talk, and that's it. So now that I've got it out of my system, I can just go on from there. I want to begin by saying that I want to thank you all for the warmness that I have received here. I especially want to say that of all the conferences, and I've been all over the place giving conferences, this is the first conference where I have seen signing for the hearing impaired. And, you know, that's the kind of stuff of which our healing is made. I say that because we all suffer from a disease of kind of being damnably different. And when we can come here and see people just like us, that's the stuff that makes us heal and helps us see that we're a child of God. You know, being a visitor, you can always say things that the locals kind of can't get away with. And so I want to say, I think that, you know, if I could give one word of encouragement, it's that we need to see more black people up at this front table, and we need to see more brown people up at this table, and we need to see more gay people up at this table. We need to see more young people up at this table, and we need to see more drug addicts up at this table. And we probably need to see somebody up at this table with AIDS, because that's the naughty word nobody wants to use. And for those of you that think AIDS are those people out there, I want to suggest to you, you are sitting next to all the people in the high-risk group right this minute. Because we are, or were, the wettest and the sleaziest of the sleazy. And if you say, well, I didn't drink and I'm an Al-Anon, well, you slept with us, dear. Now that's true, I promised only one. So I will do penance for many weeks after this penance. You know, I want to share with you, I worked with a young man, about 32, who died very recently of AIDS. He was gay, and he was 2 years clean and sober. He discovered that he had AIDS. He didn't even know he was positive. He discovered he had AIDS when he was a year sober. And he found out the day before he got his cake. And when he got his cake, he brought his cake home, and on the way home from the meeting, he bought a bottle of scotch. And he sat at the table, and he looked at the cake, and he looked at the bottle of scotch, and he prayed for a minute, and he ate the cake, and he poured the scotch down the sink. And when he came to see me when he was about 2 years sober, about 6 months before he died, he was very scared. He had lost about almost 100 pounds. He was just slightly over 100 pounds and about as tall as I am. And he said, I came here because I'm Irish and I'm Catholic and you're a recovering priest and I'm scared to death. And I don't want to hear any shit about dying because I'm not going to die. But in case I do, I'm scared to death of meeting God because I think God still hates me. And I looked at him and I said, I can't tell this story without getting very touched. I said, well, we won't talk about death then. What we'll talk about is the little boy and how we can help him pack his suitcase to go home to his father. And so we worked for several months, and about a week or two before he died, I had the privilege of saying Mass at his house for he and his family. He weighed, I think, about 73 pounds, and there was nothing but bones. He had a hard time breathing, and we had the Mass, and it was very beautiful. And at the end of the Mass, he asked his family to leave. And he asked me to come sit very close to him and touch him, which I did. And he got the most beautiful smile on his face. And he said, "Thank you, because you helped me so much." And the little boy is now packed, and he's ready to go home to the Father who loves him. And that's what I think spirituality is all about. And that's the spirituality that I really want to share with you today about little boys and girls who are packing their suitcases and getting ready to go home. It makes me sad there are still a lot of people in AA who still think, despite all the rhetoric, that Alcoholics Anonymous is about quitting drinking. And I want to share with you, this may sound heretical, but I did not need Alcoholics Anonymous to quit drinking. If I wanted to quit drinking, I would have blown my brains out, because for sure I would have never had another drink. And if you came to AA simply to stop drinking, the good news is you saved your liver. You may continue to lose your ass. It kind of reminds me years ago when I was stationed in Detroit, as a matter of fact. I was stationed in a parish over on the west side. And I was hearing confessions one day, and a guy came into the confessional and said, "Yeah, dear Father, like that, bless me and all that, for I've sinned, and it's been about 3 weeks since my last confession." He said, "I've been to 23 hookers." Thought, this boy's been busy. I went to adult bookstores 45 times. I masturbated about 3 or 4 times every day. And had impure thoughts, who's counting? For these and all my sins, I'm heartily sorry. I kindly ask for penance and absolution. And I thought, gee, pal, this is quite a time you've been having here. What are you going to do about this? He said, "Well, it's almost Lent, and I think I'm going to give up candy." I said, "Pal, that may save your teeth, but it ain't going to do no good for your pecker or your soul. I mean, let's get real here for a moment." And, the point, it gets worse, I'll tell you, it gets worse. For some of us, the toxicity lasts a long, long time. So just remember, I have a disease, and you're having lunch tomorrow with a bishop or a cardinal. I hope you have amnesia. But I recognized in my process of recovery that what I came here for more than anything else was to find God and to find someone that God could love as his own child by the name of Juniper. And what I have learned in my recovery is that I've had to look at a whole lot of things on the road to getting well. And not that I'm at home plate by any means, but I had to look at my smoking. I smoked 4 packs a day, and it really hit me when I was about 2 years sober. You know, why am I working so hard not to die of alcoholism so that I could die of emphysema and lung cancer? I mean, somehow that sounded to me like the insanity I wanted to get rid of in step 2. And that if I was continuing to smoke and smoke and smoke, how could I go around saying that I had a spirituality and that I was a child of God? How could I do that? It didn't make sense. Because how could I love a God whose child I was trying to kill? And you know, for those of you who are smoking right now and saying, "You son of a bitch." And I know you're there, because for years I sat there smoking saying, "You motherfucker, shut up! There's a free goddamn country!" You know, I don't judge you, I just simply say know that my prayer for you is that you get in touch with that little kid inside, because you are gagging him or her on a regular basis, and you are going to kill that precious child within. I had to look at my food, because I recognized that I grew up in a family where we never learned how to eat anything but macaroni and cheese, bologna sandwiches, and a real hot meal with great company with Chef Boyardee. And I had to learn how to eat. And I recognize I work in my role as a therapist, I work with a lot of eating disorders. And I'll tell you, looking around this room here, I mean, I could come here and be a very wealthy man. Because there are a lot of eating disorders sitting in this room. And I'll tell you what I've learned from eating disorders, my own and the people I work with, is that every extra pound we carry on us is a pound of anger. Every pound of excess weight we carry on our body is a pound of dishonesty. And you know, I don't know, we have them in California, but I'm sure you have them here too. You know, all these great women in the program, about 60 pounds overweight, love to wear, and men too for that matter, love to wear big t-shirts with teddy bears and cutesy-wootsy, you know, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and smiling, and, you know, they make all the cookies and do all the, you know why they make all the cookies, for Christ's sake. And, you know, do all this wonderful and nice things, and they always look like teddy bears, and they're real sweet and nice. Well, my advice is stay clear. Because I've worked with these women in therapy, and they've got enough anger in them to start a nuclear war. And they cover it with all that sweetness and light because they think if they ever got rid of that fat and let it out, they'd start to kill. And without a spirituality, they probably would. And I've had to look at my work, and I still have. I think work is my #1 drug of choice, and I still keep battling with it because I still look at people who work 10 hours a day as slackers and part-timers. And I have to keep looking at that, and God keeps sending me in all kinds of bizarre ways back to my own recovery to look at that. But I've had to look at all those things. I've had to look at money. I had to look at my own prejudice. I was one of those Humphrey liberals that said, I'm not prejudiced, my God, I was with Kennedy, I was in peace marches, I was in civil rights marches in college, and when I got sober, God made me manage an apartment building in the ghetto. And I found out I was one of the biggest racists I'd ever met. And I had to deal with the fact that if I were going to have a relationship with God, I couldn't hate anybody. Because either everybody is God's child or only some of us are, And the bad news is, if only some of us are, there's some good evidence God probably didn't choose alcoholics to be his children. And it doesn't make sense that I could have a relationship with God while I'm pushing other people away. So I've had to deal with all those things in recovery. And the thing that I keep learning over and over and over again in my recovery is that recovery is not about working the steps. That's one of the things you do. Recovery is not just about going to meetings. That's one of the things you do. It's not just about having a sponsor or reading the big book. Those are things you do on the way to getting well. What recovery is about is it's about not doing things that hurt this child of God. It's about learning to feed me as if I were important to God. It's learning, especially as a sexual addict, how to use my body and to view my body as if it was something created by God, as something very beautiful and very precious. It's about trying to do all the things in my life that I can to treat me as if I were a child of God. I often talk in both the therapy work I do and also in retreats that I think if we could summarize spirituality, especially the spirituality for us as alcoholics, in one simple sentence, it would be simply that we are wounded children trying to become children of God. And not because we always haven't been, but because we often have not known that we are. And even with years of sobriety, we continue to treat ourselves as if we're crap. You know, when I go to a meeting, especially when you get a meeting with a lot of bleeding deacons and you see these guys sitting there at this meeting, telling, usually they have about 13, 15 years of sobriety, tough macho bullshit. Yeah, well, I'm going to tell you, you young sons of bitches that walk in here, how you get sober, and you either do it my way or fuck you, asshole. And they're sitting there chain smoking, they're 60 pounds overweight, and saying, if you want what I have, you young asshole, nobody wants what they have. I know this is heresy, but I sat at a meeting in Escondido shortly after I moved there with a bunch of good old boys sitting at a meeting, talking the shit to you fucking newcomers. And this guy with 15 years of sobriety said, I'm here to tell you, son, that going to an AA meeting is the high point of my life. And the stupid son of a bitch running the meeting called me about 3 minutes before it was over, and I raised my hand. I said, I'm Juniper, I'm an alcoholic, and I don't want to take anybody's inventory, but I'm going to. And I said, if after 15 years of sobriety, the high point of your meeting, or your life, the high point is going to a meeting and trashing newcomers, you should kill yourself. You really should kill yourself. Because your TV is broken, your wife left you, and you're a mess. And for a lot of those guys, the only reason they go to meetings and tell those same old tired stories is we're the only place tolerant enough to listen to that shit day after day after day. And I'm here to tell you, for those of you who are new in the program, that is not Alcoholics Anonymous. And that is not a spiritual program. That is your mom and dad. And if you want a real good dose of that, just go home. Don't go to a meeting. You know, because most of us have parents that talk to us that way. Told us we didn't know shit about shit, and we were going to be shit, and that's all the shit they were ever going to get from us. And that isn't recovery. That's sober insanity and sober sickness. Well, enough of that. I want to tell you about when I first came to AA. You know, whenever I listen to speakers up here, and they always, not always, but often talk about how, you know, they were sick, and they tell funny stories about the drinking. I never tell funny stories about drinking because I don't have any. And I always tell people if drinking were funny, I'd be doing it. And if I could take drugs and party, I wouldn't be sitting here in this room right now. I'd be out partying and having one hell of a good time, but that's not what drinking was for me. That's not what drugs were for me. It was a nightmare. So I don't have any funny stories about that. But you know, when I hear people, speakers up here, talk about how they came to their first AA meeting, and you know, the door opened to their first AA meeting, and they walked in, and they sat down, and there was some soft organ music playing in the background. And everyone sat there kind of just holding hands and swaying back and forth, humming some soft song. And a voice from heaven said, "Fred, this is AA and we love you." I think they're full of shit. I mean, I don't know where they got sober, but I think those people were on good drugs, if that's what it was like. I mean, when I came to AA, I circled the block the first meeting about 12 times to make sure that no one would see me, so that no one would think I was an alcoholic. I mean, everybody in town saw me drunk all the time, but I didn't want them to think I was an alcoholic. And unlike some of you high-class folks that, you know, get sober in Grosse Pointe or some hotsy-totsy place, I got sober with real street-level drug addicts, prostitutes, mental patients. I mean, you know, that was just a wild place. And the first thing I did when I was going in, I was worried someone would see me going in. When I got in there, I was worried they'd see that I was there, because those people were weird. And I remember sitting at my first meeting and looking around. My liver was about 12 times its normal size. I needed to use both hands and a foot to hold on to a cup of coffee so I wouldn't spill it. I had this terrible thing about how I'd get in the middle of a sentence and my mind would go blank. And I looked around at this room and said, "Boy, Juniper, now you've really done it. This is about as low as you're ever going to go." But you know, for some reason I stayed. And I think I stayed because when I was about 15 days sober and had already started teaching people in AA how to pray. And I did. It was incredible. I mean, I was just... And this old guy came up. He had about 35 years of sobriety, and he just smiled, and he put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "Juniper, keep coming back." And I kind of pulled myself up, and I walked out of that room, and I said, "They want what I have." And I kept coming back to help all those people in AA with 30 and 40 years of sobriety who needed me to teach them how to pray. So I was about, 35 days sober, and I was sitting at a meeting, and this 68-year-old hooker in a mini skirt and enough hanging skin to, do what with, in the middle of my sharing about the meaning of true prayer in the life of a recovering alcoholic, grabbed me by the shirt right in the middle of my sharing and said, "If you don't shut the fuck up, asshole, I'm going to march down your throat." And this may come as a surprise to you, but I got my feelings hurt. So I kept coming back just to prove that old broad wrong. But you know, I worked real hard, like so many of us do who grew up in alcoholic families. I worked real hard at this program. I knew if I didn't, I was going to die. And you know, a lot of people say that, and we get a lot of high-bottom drunks these days. I was not a high-bottom drunk. There wasn't much left to either my life, my liver, or my brain. And I had lost just about all my friends. The church didn't want to have anything to do with me. And, you know, I could hardly look at myself in a mirror. So I worked real hard. You know, they told me to get a sponsor. I got a sponsor, a real son of a bitch. They told me to go to meetings. For the first 6 months, I went to 3 meetings every single day, no matter what. And for the second 6 months of my sobriety, I went to meetings twice a day, no matter what. And I'm not saying everybody has to do that, but you know, when you go to 2 or 3 meetings a week in the first year and you can stay sober, God bless you. I couldn't do that because I was too goddamn sick. I mean, to show you how crazy I was, about 6 months before I quit drinking, I was doing therapy and reading a book on alcoholism. And this book kept saying that the number 1 symptom of alcoholism was denial. And, you know, I started going down this book and I realized, shit, I have all the symptoms of alcoholism. You know, I was in the second of 3 stages, and, I mean, when they described the second half of the second stage and the third stage, it wasn't a pretty movie. So I remember I read this book up in Tahoe. I was spending a little vacation there, and I was driving back thinking, Juniper, you're an alcoholic. Juniper, you're an alcoholic. I mean, Juniper, get a grip here. You are an alcoholic. And for about 3 weeks, I mean, just all day long, I kept saying to myself, Juniper, you're an alcoholic. You've got to deal with it. And then one night, I was walking to pour my first drink for the day. And as I was getting ready to pour this first drink, this voice in my head said, the number 1 symptom of alcoholism is denial. Juniper, you're admitting you're an alcoholic. That's not denial. You must not be an alcoholic. And I drank for another 6 months. I mean, it made sense to me. But you know, I got real crazy no matter how hard I worked the steps. I did the steps, I did meetings, I did the sponsor, I did the writing, I did all the things they told me to do. And you know, I could go to meetings, especially after the first couple of months, and I could talk some good recovery shit. I mean, I could walk into meetings and, you know, I would be depressed. Everything would be falling apart in my life, and they'd call on me and I'd go, my name is Juniper and I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic. And I'd read a gratitude list I swiped from some other deluded son of a bitch. And I'd tell them how wonderful recovery was and keep coming back, and I'd walk out of the meeting and I'd sit all by myself and I would cry. And, you know, for those of you for whom it just kept getting better and better and better, I don't know, maybe there's something in the water, I don't know what the hell it is, but that's not how it happened to me. Despite all my efforts at recovery, for the first time in my life at about 10 months of sobriety, I became suicidal. Because as the drugs wore off, as the alcohol wore off, and I started to be able to feel again, the deepest, most honest, most genuine feeling that I ever had is that I wanted to die. And so they tell me, well, work a better 4th step, and I'd work a better 4th step, and I wanted to die even more. And they said, well, do a 5th step. So I did a 5th step, and I wanted to die even more. And they said, go to more meetings, and I went to more meetings, and that made me want to die even more. And as I looked around in my life, I used to sit every day in the dining room and look out my dining room window and see the Coronado Bridge. And this little voice in my head used to say, pal, there's the answer. Just one little dive off that bridge, and you finally won't have to listen to that voice up in your head anymore. And you won't have to feel that pain anymore. And you won't have to feel all alone anymore. And you won't have to feel like no one is ever going to be close anymore. And you won't have to feel like no matter what you do, that God will never care. And I would have died. And there were only two things that saved my butt, and it's funny how God sends things into your life. I was an absolutely avid dog hater. I hated dogs, I hated people who owned dogs. Till I dated a cute little sailor in 501 jeans who loved dogs. Suddenly I love dogs. Now I have 11 dogs and no sailor. That's how life works. But you know, at the time I had two little dogs, and the only thing that kept me alive, I mean, I wish I could say that it was the clouds opened up and God appeared and said, well, now Juniper, let's lighten up here. The only reason I didn't kill myself at that point is because I knew that nobody could ever love or take care of those two dogs the way I did, and they kept me going. And then luckily, a good friend of mine made a suggestion that saved my life. And he said, Juniper, I think you're just about ready to go to an ACA meeting, or I guess you folks out here call it ACOA. We're a little lazy in California, so we drop all the extra letters. And I can tell you that in my recovery, going to an ACA meeting is what saved my ass, because AA saved my life, but ACA is where I found my soul. Because for the first time, I could meet that little boy on the inside of me that had been hurting for so long. And I can see some of you old-timers starting to say, oh shit, here he goes. He's going to talk about that ACA shit. And I want to tell you, if you're feeling that, it's probably because you're a parent. And you probably don't want to look at your own kids and what you did to them. Oh, and you quote the big book and so many other things, but pal, read chapter 11. There's a real neat paragraph at the end of chapter 11 that says that book isn't the last word. We recognize we know only a little, that more will be revealed, and for me, that happened in ACA. I was giving a retreat years ago, and I always love kind of fooling around with people in one way or another. Depending on whether they're men in 501 jeans or not, but that's another story. But I was doing this retreat for alcoholic men, about 100 or 150 of them, after I was sober about 3 years, I think, and this was a retreat with a lot of good old boys in Southern California, been sober 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years. And so the opening night of the talk, I gave this kind of standard AA pitch, and everybody, oh, this guy's a great guy, he's one of us, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And then Saturday morning, I started talking about ACA issues, and I mean, you would have thought I, dropped a truck of septic waste in the middle of the room. And Saturday night, this old guy with, I think he had 28 years of sobriety. He was about 80 pounds overweight, chain smoker, and bragged all through the retreat that he couldn't make the retreat because he had 86 babies and they were calling him all weekend long. If you don't know what codependency is, I just gave you a definition. You know, live everybody else's recovery, then you don't have to do it yourself. But he got up after one of the talks in the evening and he stood up here and he said, my name is Vince, and I'm a grateful, recovering alcoholic with, count them, 29 years of sobriety. And I'm here to tell you, this young son of a bitch priest, talking about these goddamn ACA meetings. I went to one of them their meetings, ACA, bunch of whiners and pissers and moaners. Shit. You do what I did. You work the steps and you talk to your sponsor. You get over this shit. And besides, I had the worst goddamn father in the world. He was the most mean-riding son of a bitch I've ever met. And I forgave him 28 years ago. I don't need an ACA meeting. You know, as I get older, I've got to do that with a little more care. But I got up after that was over and I said, you know, pal, that's the best commercial for ACA that I've ever seen. Because that's the stuff that we carry around under all those cigarettes, under all that food, under all that work, under all that sex, under all that born-again religion stuff, under all that AA Nazi stuff, those compulsive meetings, the compulsive shopping, the compulsive working, the compulsive spending, under all that stuff is hidden a hurting little boy or little girl. You know what nobody talks about at these conferences? You know, everybody talks about all the great things they're experiencing in sobriety, and so you've heard those things. I don't need to repeat the great things that are happening in my life because there are a lot of them. You know what we don't talk about in this program? Is that the largest group of depressed people in our midst are people with more than 20 years of sobriety. One of the highest rates of suicide in recovery is people with more than 20 years of sobriety. And I want to suggest to you it's because, and of course we like to turn it on them and say, well, you didn't mark the steps right. Horseshit. They're depressed, they're in pain, they find it difficult to believe in God because that little boy or girl inside of them has never been tended to, and they have continued to try to kill that little child on the inside, even in sobriety. You know, we need to look at the fact that our symptoms, the smoking, the eating, the drinking, the not eating right, the not sleeping right, the overworking, the sex, and all those things are the way that we try to avoid remembering what happened as children. Now, I know some of you are sitting there as I speak saying, what the hell is this guy talking about? Oh yeah, I'm an alcoholic. Yeah, I married an alcoholic, but I came from a wonderful family. The hell you did. You know how the old-timers say, you know, if you walk like a duck and sound like a duck and talk like a duck, you probably are? Well, the bad news is ducks don't get born from chickens. And if you're a sick son of a bitch, guess who mom and dad were? And if you're sitting in one of these chairs today, you are and were a wounded child. And interestingly enough, for those of us who came from the families that were real, there were kids being beaten and bottles flying and all kinds of crazy incest. About half of us were molested as children. Most of us don't even remember it. That in a way, those of you who came from those kinds of families were and are the luckiest. So much easier for the kid to see that there was something wrong. Those of us who came from the religious families are probably the most screwed up. Because all the talk was about God and love and goodness and righteousness, and yet the kid was dying on the inside because he couldn't connect. He couldn't get love. He couldn't get the things that he or she needed most to stay alive. For years, I beat myself up for being a sexual addict, and for those of you who think, by a sexual addict, I mean that I had sex once or twice. I mean, there were days I had 5 or 6 partners. And I did a lot of sexual acting out, and I used to justify that in my drinking, and even when I got sober, by saying, well, the problem with me is I just have more hormones than anyone else. And it wasn't hormones at all. It wasn't even sex. It was the only way I knew how to connect with someone and feel okay. It was the only way I knew how to connect, because I came from a family where we never connected with one another. And when I was molested as a child, as I was several times, by both my father and a priest and a couple of other people as I was growing up, older kids, that was the only time anybody really touched me with love. Or at least what as a kid I thought was love. And that's how I kept looking for it as an adult. And I kept beating myself up and telling myself I was a bad person, and I was so desperate to be connected to someone and to have someone just hold me. But because of my childhood, I didn't know how to ask. I discovered with my eating, for years I used to eat the most bizarre things. I wouldn't eat all day, and then I'd come home and eat 3 meals and pass out, just like I did with drinking. And I realize now that I ate the way I did because A, I didn't know better, and B, because I couldn't stand all those feelings on the inside. And so I did with food, I did with ice cream, I did with sugar, I did with carbohydrates, I did with anything that would drug me to make those feelings go away. And what I discovered when I got to ACA is that one of the reasons why I could never figure out who Juniper was is that in reality there were 4 Junipers. I mean, I used to look at Sybil and think she was a quitter at only 3 personalities. And that inside of me, there was this mature adult, responsible, which is a word we use in recovery to describe controlling behavior. But there was also inside of me this incredible, rebellious adolescent who everywhere he went was fighting with somebody. And there was also this kid inside of me, this boy about 9 or 10 years old, who, like boys of that age, want to be loved by absolutely everyone. And then there was this little kid inside of me about 1 or 2 years old And he was the one I wanted most to avoid, because he is the one who was the most terrified that he would never get love, that there would never be enough, that he had to do more and more, and that he was basically useless. And so it was no wonder I couldn't figure out who the hell I was. Because I had all these people clamoring for attention, and the only one that I would ever deal with was the one who was responsible and controlling. And so is it any wonder that in recovery I ended up a workaholic? Because for a good part of that recovery, the only part of me I would listen to is the part that would be responsible, because I was so terrified of the other parts of me. That insecure teenager who wanted to screw everything that moved. That placating little boy that would bend over backwards and kiss your ass if you just pat him on the head. And that poor little kid on the inside that just wanted to be held and loved and told that he was okay. And what I want to share with you today is that the healing for all of that began as I started to work the steps in ACA. As I started to go back and to look at my childhood. Not so I could blame my parents. Yeah, they're as screwed up as I am. But see, I didn't know that as a kid. And so I had to go back and look at my family again. Not through the eyes of denial. Well, they did the best they could. Big fucking deal. They were hurt too, so what? The bottom line is today I carry the marks of my childhood inside of me. And those marks go with me into every relationship, into every work. And those marks of my childhood go with me when I get on my knees to pray. And I want to suggest to you, if you're not willing to find that little kid inside of you and give him love, you probably won't ever really find God either. Because when we come to God, we've got to bring it all. Not just the stuff from the day I got sober forward or the day I did a fifth step forward. I've got to bring the times that I was molested to my God, because they're a part of who I am. I've got to bring all those times I was beaten, because that's a part of who I am today. I got to bring that part of me that was told over and over and over again, you're not enough, and you won't be enough. And I've got to bring that part of me that heard that I was lazy. You know, I just recently had an experience. Thanks to Bobby Earl, I finally got up enough courage to get some orthotics, which are these little things you put inside your shoe, because one of my legs is about a half an inch shorter than the other, and I've been kind of hunched over and with bad posture all my life as a result of that. And I finally got these orthotics about 2 months ago, and I was sharing with some people that live with me. They were asking me how they felt, and I said, well, they feel kind of funny, but what's neat is I feel like I'm standing up straight, and it feels so neat. And this one gal who's a nurse said, well, of course you couldn't stand up straight, because your spine was out of line because one leg was shorter than the other. And it was just like she hit me right in the face. And I remembered all the times that my mother used to come up behind me and slap me in the back and say, you lazy son of a bitch, stand up straight. And I kept hearing that message over and over again. You don't stand up straight, you must be lazy. And I became a workaholic to prove her wrong. And what's sad is that kid couldn't do it any other way. You know, the little boy couldn't do it any other way. He was standing the best way he knew how. So I came to this program and they said the answer was God, and I knew that. You know, I was a priest. No big news flash to me, kids. I knew that. The bad news was I didn't know how to find God. And you know, I listen to people to programs say, well, when you work the steps, you have a spiritual awakening, and I worked the steps, I did not have a spiritual awakening. I got depressed and suicidal. And I remember about that time I saw my head boss, the provincial, and he asked me why I thought I was an alcoholic, and I said, well, I suppose there are a lot of reasons, but one of them is I am very good at convincing people that God loves them. And I was very good. I could take murderers and child molesters and people who are unfaithful to their wives and, you know, all kinds of stuff, and I could help them come back and discover God's love for them. But you know, in my whole life, I was never able to believe that God could love me. And that created more pain in my life than I could ever tell you. And I kept wondering, why was it? I had all this education. I'd read thousands of books in theology. I had been on hundreds of retreats. I had said thousands of masses, been to thousands more. I did all the things that supposedly should make somebody feel that they are loved by God, and I never felt loved by God. Then I came to AA and I did all the things they told me to do in order to experience being loved by God. And what I discovered was I still did not feel loved by God. And what I discovered in my own journey was that the reason that I could not experience God's love for me is because inside of me there was this little kid. And when I would sit in a church, or when I would sit in meetings and listening to people talk about love and God loves you and God is so wonderful, the adult part of me would say, right on, and I'd raise my hand and I'd share after that, and I'd say, boy, I can top that. But the little kid inside of me said, that's a crock of shit. You know, when I came to ACA, I had two memories of my life before I was 15 years old. Only two memories. The first memory was when I was 5 years old. My mother was married to an alcoholic who used to beat her up on a daily basis. And I remembered one particular day when I was sitting on the porch. We were living in Michigan at the time, in Wyandotte, I think. And I was sitting up on a second floor porch, and I was listening to my mother scream and things break. And at 5 years old, I was sitting on the steps. And I was thinking to myself, if I were a man, and if I were worth anything, I'd go in there and protect my mom. But I was too scared to go in there. And there must be something terribly wrong with me. And at that point, my stepfather came out and kicked me down a flight of stairs. The second memory I have of my childhood is when I was 10 years old. And my mother was getting remarried for the third time, and she was leaving the state of Michigan and wanted to take me with her, and she needed my father's permission, who lived here in Detroit. So when I was 10 years old, they called me out on the porch. And my mother said, well, we're moving to Michigan, and, we're never going to get back here, so you've got to decide, who do you want to be with? Me, and you'll never see your father, or your father, and you'll never see me. Make a choice. And I can't explain to you what that did to me. I felt like a chainsaw went right through the middle of me. And I had to choose, did I want my right arm cut off or my left arm? And I remember I ran into my room and I was crying and sobbing and, just feeling like I was going to die. And my mother walked in and she sat on the bed. And I turned around to look at her, and she was so angry. And she said, I want you to know that I will never, ever forgive you for what you did to me today. After all I've done for you, that you would even hesitate to choose, I will never forgive you for being so ungrateful. And she got up and she walked out of the room. And I will tell you, that was the day that as a child I died. I never played after that. I never got around children. Because the message I learned from that is, if you're a kid, they can fuck with you, and they can fuck with you bad. And so from that day forward, I became one of the big people. And I got as tough as I could get. And I used to tell myself that a lot of things that got you folks depressed and upset didn't bother me. I could handle it because I was mature and I could figure it out. And besides, the past was the past. And yet, I could never get connected with God. Because, every time I'd go to a mass, every time I'd go to a retreat, every time I'd read a spiritual book, every time I'd try to pray, and the adult part of me would hear all these wonderful things and say all these wonderful things, that little kid inside of me would say, where in the fuck was your God? Where was your God when they were beating you up? Where was this God when you got sent to this family? Where was this God when you got molested? And you cried at night, God, please make him stay in his room tonight and leave me alone. Where was that God of yours when you got told over and over again that you just quite weren't good enough? That your older sister or your younger brother was so much brighter or prettier or nicer or less of a problem than you? Where was your God then? Where was your God when that father walked away and didn't come back? Where was that God of yours when as a little kid you laid in that bed and you prayed and prayed and you tried so hard to be good and you just said, God, all I want is make them stop fighting. Please, please don't let him drink today. I'm trying so hard to be such a good little boy. And what I discovered as I worked the steps in ACA is that the biggest block to my becoming spiritual and finding a God that I really believed loved me was I had to let that little kid inside get real angry at God. And so I spent a time, about a year and a half, just, fuck you, God, fuck you, asshole. And I'd go to meetings and I'd listen to people talk about spirituality and I'd look at them and say, fuck you. You know, your God eats shit. And I heard a lot. But you know, one day I was sitting and I started getting in touch with some of that anger. And I had an experience that I want to share with you today. I closed my eyes for whatever reason, and I'm not real good at imagery, so when it happens, it's usually something pretty significant. And as I closed my eyes, I saw that little boy, 10 years old, laying on the bed, crying and feeling so unloved. And I saw God sitting on that bed with me. And he was crying too. And he said to me, I can't make them stop, but I can be here with you, and I can cry with you so that you're not alone. And for the first time in my life, after being a priest for 12 years with 2 master's degrees in theology and about 3.5 years in the program, for the first time, I knew that I was a child of God too. And I knew that not because a book told me, or a sponsor told me, or some funny person at a meeting told me, or a book told me, or a Bible, or a church, or even a friend, or a lover, or a sex partner, or any of that stuff. I found my God because I saw a little boy cry. And I saw a God who could cry with him. And that since that time, I don't yet walk on water. I swim a little better, but we won't go into that. But today, as I deal with my various symptoms, whether it's the sex or the eating or the work or money or whatever it is, today I can do that with more love and understanding, because I know that God does go with me and that he does love me. And I know that in the nights when I am alone, and those happen, and when I cry, and when I wonder, will there be someone there to love me ever? I remember that picture. And I know that God is laying there with me. And he is lonely with me. And he is scared with me. And he wonders with me, will he ever be loved? By telling you a story, because I've gone on long enough. But before I do, I want to tell you something I'm doing A couple of years ago, I was speaking at an ACA convention, and it slipped out. I did not prepare this at all, but at the end of my talk, I said there is going to come a day when I am going to build a retreat house for all of those like us who were raised in alcoholic and dysfunctional families. And everybody clapped, and I got down, and I thought, what in the fuck did you say now? I had no money. And I thought, well, just another day of standing under the sun too much, oh well. Today, about 2.5 years later, I have the property, I have the buildings. About 2 weeks ago, we had a planting party, had about 125 recovering people there who worked together without fighting, and who during the Mass cried. And the thing I kept hearing over and over again is these big, scared people say that they felt like this was a safe place, and that maybe they could come here and find that little child locked inside. And we got a lot of work and a lot of money to go, but we're going to get there because God keeps opening the doors one day at a time. And the name is Casa de Belén, House of Bethlehem. And it's for all those people who, like Jesus, started life by feeling there was no room in the inn. And it's going to be, I think, one of the first 12-step retreat houses specifically for all the 12-step programs. And I ask you to pray for me in that venture, because it just keeps healing me as God keeps opening one door after another. And I need your prayers so that, I don't chicken out. I want to close by telling a short story that, maybe if you remember this and forget everything else I say, that'll be great. It is a story about a poor sharecropper somewhere in the South who was so poor that he and his family did not own a mirror. And so even though, of course, he and his wife and kids knew how each other looked, they did not know how they looked themselves, because none of them had ever looked in a mirror before. And so one day, after a storm where the sharecropper helped his family, or a family next door, save their crop, as a way of thanking him, the neighbor gave him the gift of a mirror for he and his family. And because they were very poor, they were not used to gifts, so he ran home excited and got the family together and ripped open the brown wrapping. And for the first time, he looked into a mirror and he saw himself and thought, God, what a fox! I mean, this girl is lucky! And then he passed the mirror to his wife, and she too looked in the mirror for the first time. And as we might expect, she kind of straightened her hair and smiled and even blushed a little bit, as she too for the first time realized that she was very, very beautiful. And thought to herself, I'm going to make this boy pay. Then he passed the mirror to their young 17-year-old daughter, and she too, for the first time, looked in the mirror. She saw she was very, very beautiful. And her head got big as only a teenager's could. And she, for the first time, understood why every time they went to town, all the boys went a little crazy. And then a moment of sadness came as they passed the mirror to their 13-year-old son. He too, for the first time, saw himself in the mirror. And because he had been kicked in the face by a cow one morning when he was a little boy, had broken many of the bones in his face, and because they were poor, they could not afford doctors and surgeons. With each year, his face got more twisted and more gnarled and more homely. And he looked into the mirror, and for the first time he saw what he looked like. And he began to cry. And he looked at his mother and his father and his sister, all who were so beautiful. And he said, "How can you love me? I am so very. How can you love me? I am so very, very ugly." And his mother did what we hoped a good parent would do. She walked over and embraced him tightly and said very simply, "I love you simply because you are mine. I love you simply because you are mine." I know that a lot of you in this room, if not all of you, have looked into a mirror many, many times, both while we were drinking and using and in recovery, and have felt that very, very deeply. God, how can you love me? I am so very, very ugly. And know this, that who stands with you in that mirror and who cries with you is a God who says again and again and again, "I love you simply because you're mine." God bless you all. Thank you.